I'm sorry, but like a kindergartner would have done better due diligence on this story than you.
The CBC recently reported Conservative MPs frustrated after Poilievre bars them from promoting housing fund sources, and then went on to say, one party source says MPs are being prevented from helping cities for partisan reasons. Sounds pretty damning, but is it true? We spoke to two of our sources who independently told us a very different story, with important details that the CBC conveniently neglected to mention.
Let's take a look.
The Honourable Minister for Infrastructure, Housing and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, with all the time and energy he spends on me, I'm going to have to send him a check for the time I've been living rent-free in his head. But, look, I got to tell you, yesterday, make no mistake, the Conservative leader announced he would make multi-billion-dollar cuts to programs that will get homes built in this country. Now, he knows that, and we can agree on that piece. What he doesn't know is his caucus colleagues have been going behind his back, writing me letters advocating for their communities to receive funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund because they believe it will get more homes built. My question for the Conservative members of his caucus, will they have the courage to stand up and tell him he's wrong?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's the only rent he hasn't doubled. And nobody else has to tell that member that he's wrong because he told himself. This is what he said about his own Housing Accelerator Fund. Let me quote it. The Housing Accelerator Fund doesn't actually go towards the cost of building houses. It doesn't actually lead to the construction of specific homes. The Housing Accelerator Fund doesn't actually directly build homes. And he's right. Since he started forking over these big checks, construction has gone down in the major municipalities that has received it. So will he cut the bureaucracy, axe the tax, and build the home?
So we're showing you this video for a reason. This video was from Question Period on Tuesday, October 29th. This was one day after Pierre announced the intent to cut GST on all new home builds, and that he would fund that by essentially cutting the Housing Accelerator program. So Sean Fraser decided to do something a little nefarious, but we'll get to that in a minute. What we want to do is kind of show you how this sequentially moved along here, and then we're going to go back and completely tear it apart. So this was essentially step one of what happened that week and the week subsequent to that. So Sean Fraser made this statement in the House of Commons. Now, in normal news cycles, one little statement in the House of Commons isn't going to make the news. But funny enough, it did for one organization. You'll never guess who.
So this article was published in the CBC, titled Conservative MPs Backed Communities Seeking Liberal Housing Fund Poilievre Vows to Cut. Liberal government says it struck 177 Housing Accelerator Fund agreements with municipalities. 5 Conservative MPs have written letters to the Liberal Housing Minister asking him to grant their communities funding from a program that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre this week called disastrous and promised to cancel. Housing Minister Sean Fraser made the revelation in the House of Commons Tuesday while responding to a question from Poilievre. Quote, what Poilievre doesn't know is his caucus colleagues have been going behind his back, writing me letters advocating for their communities to receive funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund because they believe it will get more homes built, end quote, Fraser said. Quote, my question for the Conservative members of his caucus, will they have the courage to stand up and tell him he is wrong? End quote. The letters reviewed by the Canadian press were sent between September 2023 and February 2024 by Dan Albus, Michael Cooper, Adam Chambers, Leanne Rood, and Rob Moore. The MPs represent ridings in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and New Brunswick.
So The interesting thing is CTV was not going to be outdone by CBC and decided to jump in on this. So they go even further by titling their article, "Going Behind His Back, Tory MPs Support Federal Housing Program That Poilievre Vowed to Cancel." The Canadian press has reviewed 5 letters sent between September 2023 and February 2024 by Dan Albus, Michael Cooper, Adam Chambers, Leanne Rood, and Rob Moore. The MPs represent ridings in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Doesn't that sound familiar?
Yeah, it's interesting because both these articles used Canadian press as their main source, so they are almost identical.
Continuing on. The letters asked Fraser to approve their community's applications to access the Housing Accelerator Fund, a program that invited municipalities to compete for a pool of money based on the ambitiousness of their plans to build more housing. Poilievre announced on Monday that he would abolish the program and instead use the money to fund his plan to scrap the federal sales tax on new homes sold for less than $1 million. Now, wait a minute. The title of this article was Tories were basically going behind Poilievre's back after he vowed to cut the program.
Which was earlier in the week, being the week of the 30th.
Right. The article was actually published on October 30th. Pierre Poilievre announced the intent to cut the program on the 28th. Now, the interesting thing is I just read in the article that the Canadian press reviewed letters sent by the MPs between September of 2023 and February of 2024. So how could they have gone behind his back between September and February if he just announced he was going to cut the program that previous Monday?
In October. End of October.
So, never mind clickbait. That is like straight out lies in the headline of CTV. Now, everyone's going to say, well, what do you expect? They actually made up a whole bunch of video footage about Pierre Poilievre. Right. But CBC is also doing that.
Yeah, I think this was one of the other things that got you and I to start Northern Perspective is we were so sick of reading mainstream media and trying to be informed citizens only to be spoon-fed garbage from the left. Like, the right was always painted in a horrible light, and we knew it wasn't the truth.
Now, this isn't the worst part of this, folks. This is pointing out the surface level of the dishonesty in this. So not only did CBC decide to just take an article straight from a 30-second answer that Sean Fraser made in question period and post that, and then it was reposted by CTV. Not only that, they then said, oh, well, they're going behind his back because Sean Fraser told us so we didn't bother to care about doing any due diligence to follow up to see if that was actually the case, even though we have information from the Canadian press that the letters that they reviewed were from September to February.
Well, the other question is, how did the Canadian press end up with these letters in the first place?
That's a great question, Tanya. That's a really great question.
Thank you.
So we're going to come back to that, but let's keep going for now. Now, CBC wasn't done, so they decided to post yet another article on November 6th.
At least 17 Conservative MPs advocated for money from a housing program Poilievre vows to cut. Liberals have written to warn more than 100 municipalities that already have made deals to access the fund. More than a dozen Conservatives wrote to the federal government on behalf of communities in their ridings, calling for them to receive funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund, a program Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has promised to cut. Poilievre's office released the names of the 17 Conservative MPs on Tuesday after Housing Minister Sean Fraser said about a dozen of them wrote to him in recent months. Poilievre's office also says Conservative MPs will no longer support municipalities seeking money through the fund. The Housing Accelerator Fund is a $4.4 billion program that gives money to towns and cities that commit to reducing red tape in order to build more homes. A spokesperson for Fraser's office said 177 deals have been struck between the federal government and municipalities, and more than $1 billion has been dispersed to communities through the fund. Poilievre has said he would cut this program, which he calls bureaucratic, to partially fund eliminating the GST from sales of newly built homes costing less than $1 million. His office pointed to a federal document showing the Housing Accelerator Fund has cost $80.9 million to administer since 2017, slightly more than what the city of Halifax recently received in funding. Fraser's office confirms that since Poilievre announced he would eliminate the fund last week, the federal government has written to warn more than 100 municipalities that already have made deals to secure funding. On Tuesday, some Liberal MPs and ministers told reporters that the Housing Accelerator Fund will lead to the construction of more than 250,000 homes in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Minister of Defense Bill Blair, who represents a Toronto area riding, warned that if Poilievre cuts the program, municipalities with ongoing financial agreements could be left in the lurch. Quote, "He has promised to cancel the agreements that we have made with municipalities. That could put them in significant legal jeopardy for the future," end quote, he told reporters. Pretty damning article.
Yeah, damning. That's a word for it. Now, the whole thing about this that really stinks is this whole narrative around the implication that the Conservative MPs just on their own decided, you know what? I'm going to advocate for the Housing Accelerator program that the Liberals put in place. I think it's a great idea, and I'm going to write a letter to Sean Fraser asking for money.
Well, and then the Pierre Poilievre somehow found out and got upset with them and then said, okay, nobody's allowed to do this anymore.
Right. And nothing could be further from the truth. And the truth is the one thing that we keep getting annoyed with the CBC and the CTV and all the other mainstream media outlets, because they don't care about the truth. They really don't. What they care about seems to be is earning their government paycheck that they get from the Liberal government. So, what's really going on here? Well, the first thing that we need to dive into is something called simply a letter of support. Now, you heard that, and you heard it in the article, but you probably thought it was just describing what the Conservatives were doing. But it wasn't. A letter of support is actually a named artifact in a process. What are we talking about? Well, we could only find one that was made public. And ironically, it was by Elizabeth May. So let's take a look. So here's a fancy piece of stationery for everybody to see. And this is Elizabeth May's letter of support for the federal funding for a provincial capital housing strategy for modular housing in British Columbia.
Which, this was the only one we could find. It was very difficult to get our hands on this, which makes you ask the question, how did the Canadian press get 5 of these letters?
Well, that's the magical question, isn't it? So what is in this letter is basically who this is addressed to. So you can see Dear Parliamentary Secretary Vaughan, so it's directly to somebody. And who would that somebody be? Well, that's somebody that's going to be in charge of the program or related to somebody who's going to be in charge of the program of which they're requesting funding. And it's a lot of templated stuff. A lot of this is given to the MP by the actual community to put in there as justification, but it adds weight to the actual request, and it's part of a process. And here's the second page of the document. So this is where Elizabeth's letter leads to a conclusion. She signs it, and it's notarized accordingly, as well as another member of Parliament down below, you can see. So what is this thing? Well, this is actually something that not only MPs do, members of Parliament do it, MLAs do it, MPPs do it, mayors do it. So what do they do it for? And what process am I talking about? Well, let's take a look. So the process begins at the top. Research funding, opportunities, and eligibility. So that's where the community or the organization is going to be doing their due diligence and research, what kind of funding opportunities the federal government even offers. Next stage, community identifies project and funding needed. So if you're going to be building a sewer system, well, that's going to be your opportunity and your project. You're going to be getting some estimates on what you need for that project in terms of funding. Next stage, community prepares detailed proposal, objectives, budget, and impact. All sorts of documentation would be prepared in that stage in terms of how you're actually going to be achieving that project. Next is important because this is where you seek letters of support. So letters of support, there's that term again. It is an actual artifact that you need for this process. And this isn't just from MPs. This is from MPs, MLAs, MPPs, mayors, any government official. And that helps to add weight to your actual request that this is serious and there's support from your local community leaders. The MP then reviews and provides that letter of support and then sends it off, just as we saw with Elizabeth May. The community then submits the application for the actual funding because the letter of support has already been delivered. The government then takes that, reviews that, grants or denies it, and then there's potential clarification or adjustments by the government body. The funding decision is then made, and then the community submits progress final reports to the funding body of which it received the funding in the first place, and then it implements the project. So there's a whole process that's involved in this. And the Housing Accelerator Fund isn't the only thing that people are and have been applying to actually get funds for. Let's look at something else. This is something called the New Horizons for Seniors program, community-based projects up to $25,000. Now, you may be shocked to hear this, but this is actually from the Harper government, and it's still around. So you can actually see that this walks you through the process of what if you wish to actually apply for this. And if you look at the very bottom of this page, it says a letter indicating provincial or territorial agreement if applicable. And it also includes the letters of support. So these letters of support, this is an ongoing thing.
It's a standard thing that an MP would write for their constituents. Essentially, it's a letter asking the federal government for tax dollars to be spent in the community.
And any Liberal MP that was around during the time of the Harper government would have been writing letters of support that their community and constituency would be asking them in order to get money for the New Horizons project, which is under the Harper Conservative government.
Well, and it's not just Conservative and Liberals. It's every party. Every party would be writing these letters of support for particular government programs to ask for the government to give them money that can be spent on these programs within their community. You know, Bloc, NDP, Green, Independent, everybody.
Now, here's some of the most important parts of this. If you put yourself in the shoes of an MP and your community is coming to you and saying, hey, listen, I want to request federal dollars to help our community. You're going to say, sure, no problem, unless it's like something crazy, like, putting in a bunch of meth labs. You're going to say, sure, you know what, no problem, I'd be happy to do that. Why? Because that's what MPs do. They support their constituencies. And they're not asking for Liberal dollars. They're not asking for Liberal dollars from a Liberal program. What they're doing is they're lending support to the community asking for taxpayer dollars. It's not the MP. It's not the MPP. It's not the mayor. It's the community or the organization itself that is making the request.
Right, and it's not Liberal money. It's your money. It's taxpayer money. And they're asking the government, because the government controls the spending, they're asking the government for some of that money back so that they can spend it in their community.
And the important thing is when were they asking this, right? When were these organizations asking this, and when were the Conservative MPs writing these letters of support. Again, it wasn't after October 28th, 2024. It was actually 8 months to a year or more before that. Why then? Well, remember what happened last September. The Liberals hadn't activated the Housing Accelerator Fund, even though they ran on it in 2021, but they hadn't activated it until last fall. So, once it was activated, communities started requesting funds from it. So they approached their MPs. Hey, can you write a letter of support? Sure, no problem. Now, the other interesting thing is that the Canadian Press, which was republished by CBC, which was republished by CTV, specifically mentioned the fact that they had letters between September and February. Why February? Well, in February, Sean Fraser did something really stupid.
Just in February?
Well, just in February.
Doesn't he do that all the time?
One of the examples of him doing something really stupid. He went to committee, and we've showed you this before, but if you haven't seen it, this is a doozy, folks. Take a look.
How many houses have been built?
So the Housing Accelerator Fund only started reaching agreements in September of this year. So though it was campaigned on in 2021 and budgeted in 2022, the actual fund led to agreements beginning in September of this year. It's also important to understand the Housing Accelerator Fund doesn't go toward the cost of building houses. It goes towards incentivizing changes at municipal levels that will speed up permitting processes and end exclusionary zoning and increase density around post-secondary institutions, infrastructure, transit, etc. So it's one that will lead to more homes, but the nuance in your question is important. It doesn't actually lead to the construction of specific homes.
Pardon? But it's the Housing Accelerator Fund.
But I thought the Liberals were building more homes.
Right. They're building 4 million homes by 2030, right? Using the Accelerator Fund. But it's not accelerating anything because it doesn't build homes.
It doesn't go toward the cost of building houses.
As per Mr. Housing Minister Sean Fraser. So this testimony was given in February of this year. You know what didn't come after February of this year?
More letters?
Any more letters of support from Conservative MPs.
Well, not that they handed the Canadian Press anyways.
Well, and this is the thing, folks. This takes us back to Mr. Sean Fraser, and we have to go back to October 29th, where he magically says in the House of Commons, oh, well, there's all these Conservative MPs that went behind his back.
What he doesn't know is his caucus colleagues have been going behind his back, writing me letters.
And how would the Canadian Press know of this? Well, we also did some research, and we were able to determine that this Liberal government is the first government in the history of Canada that we've been able to identify that has actually published in the press letters of support from MPs unless there's something nefarious going on, like they're helping a drug smuggler or something. So the only way the Canadian Press would actually be able to get these letters is directly from the Liberal government. So look at this. So Sean Fraser and the Liberals are like, we need something, anything to hit the Conservatives over the head with because we have nothing that's sticking. So Pierre just announced he's going to cut the program. Well, let's go digging in the mail, everybody. Oh, look, I found these letters. Hey, let's just leak them out to the Canadian Press and talk about it in question period, and maybe we'll get a story done because they're on our payroll anyway. So the Canadian Press gets a hold of it, publishes their story. CBC says, oh, we're on the government payroll. Oh, Sean, you want us to do a story? Sure, no problem. Okay, we'll do that story. They reprint almost the exact same article. CTV reprints almost the exact same article. Everybody's on the government payroll, so everyone's using the same talking points. And they're all using it extremely dishonestly. Because, just to recap, they are saying that Pierre made his announcement and then all of these MPs wrote to Sean Fraser begging him for funding.
The actual timeline is that in September 2023 to this past February of 2024 is when the letters were written. October the 28th of 2024, the Monday, that's when Pierre said that he was condemning the Housing Accelerator Fund. The day after that, the Tuesday, the 29th, is when Sean Fraser stood up in question period and made that rant that we showed you at the beginning of the video. The very next day, the 30th, is when CBC published this article saying that the Conservatives, there was 5 of them who had written letters to Sean Fraser about this Housing Accelerator Fund that the Conservatives were going to shut down. So what's the narrative here?
Well, and here's the other thing. What our sources have told us is that it's actually quite disgusting that the Liberals are trying to wave these letters of support around as some indictment, because it's literally what every single MP is supposed to do.
It's their job. It's their job to write these letters of support.
Right. It's literally their job to
Right.
support their community. So you're saying the Liberals, who've been standing up and jumping up and down, having temper tantrums in the House of Commons, saying the Conservatives, aren't trying to work with us, and they actually said, all right, well, our community wants to try and get some funds from the Housing Accelerator program. We don't know if it's going to work or not, but we might as well get in on it early because they literally just announced it. You heard Sean Fraser say we just started signing agreements in September of 2023.
So the Housing Accelerator Fund only started reaching agreements in September of this year.
And then they found out it didn't work when he testified in February of 2024.
It doesn't go toward the cost of building houses.
So all of them are like, okay, so we're not going to do that anymore. And now they're jumping up and down, waving these around. So what was the reaction of the Conservatives? Did Pierre go around and tell them, you're not to do this anymore? Kind of. What he did tell them, from what we heard, is there's no more letters of support. Because, yes, partisan reasons, not the reasons that the Conservatives are talking about, but because what the Liberals have actively chosen to do is step over a line that no government has actually ever done and started to weaponize, literally, the day-to-day job of MPs.
This is what our 2 sources independently told us. They said that MPs write these letters of support. Doesn't matter the government, doesn't matter the party. That's part of the MP's job. They write these letters to the government to ask for funds to be spent in their constituency. That's normal. What the Liberal government has done that is not normal is they have now taken these letters and weaponized them by saying, look, the Conservatives are writing us for our Housing Accelerator Fund. You know that fund that they said was so bad and so awful that they're going to scrap it? They're writing us to get money for it. Of course they're writing money, or they're writing for this money because that's their job.
Well, and it's their community that is asking for the money. It's
Right.
not the Conservatives.
It's the Liberals that are making this partisan by taking these letters and giving them to the press and then saying, look, this other party is writing for our money, our funds. It's not their money. It's not their funds. It's taxpayer funds. And the MPs are writing for it because folks in their communities have spent this taxpayer money, right? We have taxes taken from us whether we want to or not. And they're just asking for some of that money back to be spent in their community.
And there's even quotes in the articles about, allegedly Conservatives are saying, it's really frustrating. Yeah, you know what? It is really frustrating. They are frustrated. They're not frustrated with Pierre. They're frustrated that the Liberals are weaponizing literally their day-to-day job.
Right. So now that these letters are being weaponized, the directive is, okay, we're not going to write any more letters if the Liberals are going to weaponize them against us and against our constituents.
Right. So all the way, leading back, look at the narrative that has been created here on October 29th by Sean Fraser in the House of Commons, and that is now being parroted by the mainstream media. And the mainstream media is seriously saying to us, oh, well, we're not biased. Like, are you kidding me?
You guys forgot this important detail about these letters, what they're for, why they're written.
And even the detail of when they were written. Like, I'm sorry, but like a kindergartner would have done better due diligence on this story than you.
So to recap, it's not that the Conservatives are saying, well, we don't want you writing any more letters for Liberal programs. That's not the case. It hasn't been the case this entire government going back to 2021 and even previous governments. That's not the case at all. Why the Conservatives are not going to be writing any letters going forward is because the Liberals are weaponizing them against the Conservative MPs and therefore against their communities.
And the other thing that is absolutely not the case is this narrative that the MPs went behind Pierre's back after he said he's going to cut this program and were begging Sean Fraser for the Housing Accelerator funds. And it was also implied that all of these MPs were actually reprimanded for that. And there's no evidence to suggest that that's the case either. Like, you really think that some of these MPs on that list, Michael Barrett, Kelly Block, Michael Cooper, people that are in Pierre's circle, would just turn around and say, screw you, Pierre, I'm going to go and ask for some money? I don't think so.
Well, and they're not saying we're not going to write these letters because we don't want help from the Liberal government or we think the Liberal government's ideas are bad or anything like that. They don't want to write any more letters because the Liberal government is turning those letters that are meant to help people. The Liberal government is taking those letters and turning them against the MPs, and that's not okay.